Van Helsing. Now that you have learned what you have learned, it would be well for you to return to your own country.
Ever since the creation of film, horror has always been there. Even with some of the most horrifying and iconic movies, even today, stemming from the early 1900s. Iconic, culture-defying films, such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and The Phantom of the Opera, were all created in the early 1920s and 1930s. One thing all of these horror icons share is the fact that they have all had their fair share of reboots and remakes to try and appease and mystify modern audiences just as much as they did back then. Unsurprisingly, however, none of these films even came close to their original counterparts, except for The Invisible Man. And The Invisible Man was a success because it didn't try to make the same film again. It was fresh and new, and clearly a passion project for the director who truly seemed to care about the character. However, we'll get back to remakes and reboots later. Right now, I want to talk about where modern horror really began, and that's the 1970s. And I feel there's no better way than talking about the 1970s with a little film you might have heard of called Halloween. Was an indie film that released on October 25th, 1978 by a little-known director named John Carpenter. The film only had a budget of $325,000, which even for back then was almost nothing. Surprisingly, Halloween had a pretty hard time being picked up by a studio, and they all thought it would fail. However, to the studio's surprise, the film raked in over $70 million, and it immediately became a classic in modern media in general, not just the horror community. And that just goes to show that you don't need a $10-20 million film to go and please audiences. I mean, this movie had people intrigued since day one, and it's still a very popular film even till today. And due to Halloween's success, there was a fair share of copycats and reboots and remakes down the way, some of which even became some of the biggest franchises of the 1980s. Almost every horror film from the 1980s took inspiration in one way or another from Halloween. Since we're now in the 1980s, I'd like to talk about my favorite horror film of all time, and maybe even my favorite film of all time. And that is
Here's Johnny!
The Shining is widely regarded to be one of the greatest horror films of all time, and Stanley Kubrick, fittingly, is known to be one of the greatest directors of all time. The Shining was the first horror film that I ever saw, and it's what really sparked my love for the genre. As surprising as it is, The Shining wasn't met with immediate praise. It was actually met with quite a lot of criticism, even Stephen King himself saying that he really hated the film in all honesty, and it was a poor representation of his book. Obviously, over the years, the opinion on the film has heavily shifted to, like I said earlier, being known as one of the greatest horror films of all time. This brings us into the 1990s, which I believe is the downfall of the horror genre.
Hello?
I'm sorry, I guess I dialed the wrong number.
So why'd you dial it again?
To apologize.
Scream is an incredible movie, and it's funny, it's unique, and that's one of the reasons why it's still popular today. The 1990s was bloated with the same copycats that we got from the 1980s and these really unoriginal and just not enjoyable films. What set Scream apart from the rest of the horror films of the 1990s was that it was self-aware, and it knew it was a cheesy teen horror movie, and it played on those cliches, and it actively tried to show you that those cliches are in fact in this.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Halloween. You know, the one with the guy in the white mask who walks around and stalks babysitters?
Yeah,
What's yours?
guess.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Wow, well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
Keep in mind, this film was directed by the same director who did Nightmare on Elm Street, so that line is simply put just funny. And that's what this movie is. It's just a funny movie, and that's what sets this film apart from the rest of the movies in this genre.
That's why she always outsmarted the killer in the big chase scene at the end. Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules?
And that little piece of throwaway dialogue is then followed up by Randy giving an entire explanation on how to survive a horror movie and the rules that are needed. And it's completely ironic, and the film knows that.
Number one, you can never have sex. No! Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number two, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number one. And number three, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Now we're in the 2000s, and I'm going to be brief because I couldn't find many clips that were suitable, because the films. In my opinion, Saw is the last good horror film of the 2000s. It was lucky enough to be released right before all of the garbage remakes that flooded the late 2000s and early 2010s. And this already, in my opinion, is a classic. Surprisingly enough, for people who haven't seen the films, Saw 1 really isn't that gory. It's more of like a crime detective film. So the reputation that it has, in all honesty, really isn't that fair. Films such as Paranormal Activity never really did anything for me because it was just filled with the cheap jump scares that the previous decade was filled with. Now, I honestly didn't really have much faith in this genre up until this film.
Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Jordan Peele created a masterpiece of cinema. Get Out is one of the greatest films I've ever seen, and I'm not talking about just horror, but in general. It's one of the most unique and compelling stories I've heard in ages, and it deals with the issues that we face in our real world. Now, since this film is fairly recent, I'm not going to dive into spoilers, but if you haven't seen this movie, you must. It is a masterpiece of cinema. It truly is. Jordan Peele was the light that we needed in this genre. After slasher after slasher and remake after remake, this is not only a fresh film, but a masterpiece. And I know I've said that a lot, but I can't stress that enough. And to wrap this all up, horror's had its fair share of ups and downs. It started off strong, with films such as Frankenstein and Dracula, and all those classic Universal monster movies. Right after came another genre-defining era, the 50s and 60s, which were better known as the Hitchcockian era, with films such as The Birds and Psycho. Then came the 1970s, which I refer to as the birthplace of modern horror. Films such as Halloween and Black Christmas truly reigned supreme during this time and helped build the foundation for the decade to come after. And that, of course, being the 1980s and the slasher genre in general. This genre completely defined film for almost the next 30 years, where we're still even seeing it today. Scream helped bring horror into the modern age, and a lot of elements that were seen originally in Scream still exist in today's landscape. I believe filmmakers are starting to realize that we want something more than just cheap jump scares, and the character building and the story building is what truly enhances the story. I believe the genre is on the right path, and maybe if it stays this way, it could even prevent its downfall.
Midnight and a rendezvous.